hello, everybody.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, today I'm going to just do a quick discussion about, it's early in the Rebel Clash meta, if you want to call it that. You can call it that, but it's early. But I wanted to go over, based on a couple of tournaments that I've seen and participated in. I'm sure some of you have even done the same, participated in some online tournaments. The Limitless qualifier, though, is going to probably be hundreds, if not 1,000 people playing in it. And I think it's a huge opportunity because I don't think that this format is necessarily well defined yet. You obviously have some decks that are most likely to be the best decks, but who knows? So today's discussion, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about my opinion of the decks that are going to be the best and most played decks at the Limitless qualifier, and why that is. And then I'm going to talk about what I think, in terms of a strategy, is probably the best counter strategy to all of those top decks, and the meta in general right now. So without further ado, let's just get into those top decks. The first deck that we are going to talk about, that is one of those top decks, is going to be Dragapult VMAX. It's a pretty obvious top deck. It's just at every tournament, you see a bunch of them. I played at the LaSalle Championship, and I played personally against 4 of those decks. That's a lot. That's a lot of Dragapult VMAX. So what did I learn playing against that? Well, what I learned playing against that, there's still a bunch of variants in terms of how people are going to build Dragapult. I think that you obviously have Dragapult VMAX. The questions you have are, how are you going to accelerate energy, if at all? Are you going to manual attach? Are you going to use Malamar? Some people are using Bead. I think those are huge questions for this deck. Now, personally, I think Malamar is, even a 1-1 or a 2-2 line in a deck is necessary, because if you get O-code by something like a Baby Blounds or anything where you don't have any energy on board, you could be put in a really bad spot. On top of that, there are so many decks right now that are playing Crushing Hammers, and other cards, which I'll talk about in a second, but including Dragapult VMAX, that if you're not playing Malamar, what you're doing is you're telling your opponent, hey, if you get lucky on Crushing Hammers or whatever it might be, you're going to put me on the back foot all game. And that is how Dragapult loses, is when it can't consistently get its attacks off after turn 2. So I think Malamar is probably a necessity in Dragapult, and a few other things that are probably important to put in a Dragapult deck. You could put lots of other things in the deck, but Giratina from Unified Minds, not the one with Distortion Door that puts 2 damage counters. Now, you could put that in as well. I'm talking about the one with, I think it's called Dimension Door ability. And what that does is you put the Giratina down, and you can remove a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. That is great for so many different matchups, right? If you are playing against an ADP that uses Aurora or Rainbow energies, boom, there goes that Aurora or Rainbow energy. If you're playing against a Dragapult VMAX and they have Horus Psychic on the active, boom, there goes a Horus Psychic. If you're playing against a Pikarom and they have Speed Lightning, boom, there goes the Speed Lightning energy. There's just so much special energy that's being played in the format right now that it just makes sense to play the Giratina from Unified Minds. So that's another thing I would definitely include. 2 other things that I would certainly consider are Crushing Hammers, your own set of Crushing Hammers, because you have to assume that not everybody is going to run with the Malamar version. Not everybody is going to be able to do a switch, bead, attach, reswitch, that crazy combo. Knowing that, Crushing Hammers can certainly turn the tide for you, especially if you go second and they have the ability to get their attack off first. So Crushing Hammers, maybe even a Wait and See Hammer if you happen to be playing a greens version of Dragapult. But if you're playing Malamar, you're not going to play that. And then the last card that I think is probably a good inclusion in Dragapult VMAX is Mr. Mime's with Super Scoop Up Block, or Scoop Up Block, I think it's called. The reason that's great, for a variety of things, is it it doesn't stop you playing your own super scoop ups if you want, or scoop up nets. It just stops your opponent from playing scoop up net and super scoop up, which is huge in this matchup because you might want to ping a couple of damage to a Jirachi on the bench. I've played so many games of Dragon Ball VMAX, you ping a couple damage, and I just assume that that thing's getting scoop up netted. So playing the Mr. Mime with scoop up block is, I think, really good at keeping those Pokemon on the bench with a little bit of damage that you can just take some free prizes later. So that is sort of the baseline for Dragapult VMAX in my mind. It's a great deck because you can take a lot of prizes in very, interesting ways with damage spread. In terms of its partners, there's a variety of things that you're going to see. You're going to see Gengar and Mimikyu tag team. I've personally been experimenting with Naganadel Guzzlord tag team. I don't think it works, but I've experimented with it, right? You are probably going to see some Baby Blacephalon, the psychic one. You're probably going to even see maybe some Espeon Deoxys. Maybe. Just saying. So a lot of different things that I think you might see people experimenting with in terms of Dragapult VMAX, but great deck. Definitely I would go with the Malamar version if you want to play that. The next deck that we are going to talk about that is going to be a big popular deck is, I'm actually going to say Baby Blacephalon, the fire one. It's obvious that it's so good still because it can OHKO anything still. It can OHKO Dragapult VMAX. It can OHKO ADP. It can OHKO anything, right? And so it didn't really lose anything. It didn't, it's not losing anything. It doesn't have any sincere competitors outside of a Tapu Fini in a deck maybe. But even then, you're giving up one prize. It's not that big, or two if you're against ADP, but that's not the worst thing in the world. So I would say Baby Blacephalon is huge. Scoop Up Net certainly helps it in terms of getting your Jirachis and stuff out of harm's way, getting them, if you're up against Dragapult VMAX, right? So that your Dragapult VMAX doesn't take two prizes every turn. So Baby Blacephalon can still OHKO a bunch of things. In terms of anything that I would play in that deck, I think the deck just is what it is. You're playing your Flints and your Crystals, and you're playing... I think the only thing you might really reconsider with that deck is when you play down things like Oricorio, when and if you play down things like Dedennes. I just think that with Dragapult around and ADP around and Boss's Orders now around, you have to be a little bit more careful about putting those two prizers on the bench. Now, the one Pokemon that I think could still be really good in this deck in certain matchups is Cramorant. The reason I like Cramorant is because Cramorant is more than a 5 damage ping, 1 hit from Dragapult. It's got 200 HP, right? So 200 HP, you would have to do 5 damage counters directly to it, and then another 2 damage counters to it to get to 7, and then you can knock it out. Now, you can do that with Zigzagoon and Scoop Up Net combos, but still. And that will get you specific cards. So just something to keep in mind. You are still vulnerable to things like Reset Stamp and Marnie, which is being played quite a bit. But overall, I think Baby Blounce could be a good pick. You just got to run hot. But with the amount of Marnie and Reset Stamp that might be out there right now, I actually think it will perform a lot worse overall than maybe you would have expected. The third deck I'm going to talk about, that's a top deck. That is an obvious one again, is ADP. I'm putting ADP question mark because its partner can be a number of things. The challenge that ADP has now, if you're planning on playing that, is that you are no longer in an OHKO era, right? You can't one-hit KO those Dragapult VMAXs. You can't one-hit KO a bunch of the VMAXs, any of the VMAXs. So that is a big downside to this. And I think what you saw in this last weekend's tournaments is ADP did not do well. Because ADP relies on taking one-hit knockouts with Zacian, focusing on Zacian is maybe not the right thing to do anymore. Now, the question then is, okay, well, what do you do if it's not Zacian? I think if it's not Zacian, your partner Pokemon, it's kind of up to you, but you could look at Copperajah VMAX. Now, that takes away from the consistency a bit. You can still have Zacians in the deck, don't get me wrong, but You might think about Copperajah VMAX for being able to attack multiple times in a row. And its first attack, doing 200 damage if it's a basic Pokemon for 3 energy is not bad. So Copperajah VMAX is pretty good. Zamazenta is actually one that I would not bother with. Between Boss's Orders and all the other stuff out there, there's enough decks that are just not going to be useful. If you want a one-of Zamazenta, you could try it. Personally, I don't love Zamazenta in this current era. I just think there's too much to get around it. The other thing that you could consider is the Spiritomb build. Now, ADP Spiritomb, I think many people are thinking, well, with Dragapult VMAX, ADP Spiritomb is bad, right? They just snipe your Spiritombs and then you don't have Spiritombs. But I think you can actually play that Dragapult matchup well, which is that Dragapult has to put 5 damage counters, 5, to the bench in some way. Either you play Skyfield to stop that, or you gotta hope a little bit that your opponent doesn't have the Zigzagoons or Giratinas to combo it, or if you have, I think you might play a bunch of the Big Charms. So what you could do is you could put 1 or maybe 2 Spiritombs on the bench, force your opponent to ping them when they have no damage on. So if you have 1 Spiritomb and they have to put 5 damage counters on it, now that thing is fully powered up. If you have a Big Charm on there, you can attach a Rainbow Energy, 6 energy on board. That's enough to knock out the Dragapult VMAX, especially after an Ultra Creation. So then you're taking 4 prizes. I do think that Spiritomb in Dragapult is still possible. You just have to play it right. And because of that, I think ADP Tomb actually might do pretty well because it hits Dragapult VMAX for weakness, and it's still good against a lot of the meta outside of that. So I think a person is going to figure out how to play that matchup really well and have the right cards to make that matchup more favorable. And then I think ADP Spiritomb it might actually be the best version of ADP moving forward, just because, you know, it helps in the prize trade and it hits probably going to be one of the most popular decks for weakness. And then finally, the final top deck in this grouping is going to be Pikarom. If you watched or if you saw any of the standings and results from the last, the Neopie Open and the Lesage Championship, you will see that I believe Pikarom won both of those, or did very well, right? And what that basically tells you is that Pikarom is a good deck. It's still a good deck. It is the king of consistency. It just is. And then you add something like Boltund that can just do even more damage in the mid to late game. And you add something like Speed Lightning Energy, which helps you see a little bit more of your deck. I don't know if you run 4 Speed Lightnings in there, maybe just 2, but all of those things combined, and the consistency of it, and the fact that ADP is not your main opponent right now. Like, your main opponent is kind of Dragapult. And knowing that, and knowing that your Pokemon can survive things, especially if you play things like Super Scoop Up potentially, yeah, it makes Pikarom a very good deck. So that is another deck that I would say you should consider looking into different lists of Pikarom if you want to play it. It's super consistent. It might do very, very well at the Limitless event because it's done well at all the other events leading up to it. So I think Pikarom is the 4th of those top decks. So we have Dragapult, Baby Blacephalon, ADP partner, Metal partner, or Spiritomb. I don't think Melodic is a good one. And then you have Pikarom. Personally, I like Dragapult and Pikarom to be the best decks coming out of this. But who knows? That's just my opinion. Now, those are the top decks. In terms of the best counter strategy, I don't know what the best counter deck is going to be, but I think that the format right now is in a really good position for a good control deck. And the reason I say that is because you have multiple decks in that top tier list that, you know, don't have crazy explosive acceleration. Baby Blacephalon is the only one of those that can go from 0 to 100 in one turn, right? But even that deck is susceptible to control style strategies. So I think that something like Malamar VMAX or a control-focused Kaparaja Luke Metal deck is actually a potentially very good call for this weekend if you can really craft a list that is consistent. Now, Malamar VMAX, if you're not aware, its attack does 180. It's darkness type. So once you get that attack off, you're knocking out a Dragapult. 3 prizes right there. And what you do is you look at your opponent's hand, you take a trainer card you find there, and you put it on the bottom of their deck. Okay, that's super control-y already. On top of that, you have cards like Hammers. You have cards like Chip Chip Ice Axe. You have cards like Mismagius Reset Stamp combos, right? So you could do that with Malamar VMAX. A couple of Hammers, get some energy off the board, put, do a couple of Mismagiuses out there, get your opponent down to 4 prizes, reset stamp them down to 4, Chip Chip Ice Axe the top of their deck, and then you can hit them for 180, whatever the deck might be, and put whatever trainer card you want on the bottom. At that point, they only have 3 cards in hand, so unless they had 2 supporters in a 4-card hand, you could put their supporter on the bottom of their deck, and they might be stuck there with a dead hand drawing into nothing. Now, that is huge in this format, because if they can't find an out to Dedenne, if they can't use a supporter, all these different things, right? That, to me, is a great way to beat things like ADP, getting rid of their energy, getting rid of their supporters. That's a good way to beat things like Dragapult. If you get rid of their energy and it's early game and they don't have a bunch of Malamars or no way to switch to the bench for Malamar, Pikarom is a little tougher. Pikarom is going to play very fast, so Malamar might actually struggle. Any control deck might struggle a bit against Pikarom if you're not able to get those combos off early. But once you get those combos off, I think Malamar VMAX putting a Wobbuffet that blocks Prism Star Pokemon might be a good call. And then with Luke Metal, being able to, gust up any of those Pokemon in a Pikarom matchup and get rid of all their energy, especially in the early to mid game, could be really good. Now, you're not going to be hitting them. You're going to be, hitting into resistance. But yeah, I think a control deck of some sort. I really think that you're going to see 1 or 2 control decks making a run in day 2. I could be completely wrong. There might just not be a good, consistent way to do it. But if somebody finds a consistent way to build a control deck, I think a control deck is actually poised to do very well. It would not be a deck that if I didn't feel confident about a control deck, I would not just go and build one just for the fun. If you want to have a super fun day, probably Pikarom is the right call. If you want something that is probably going to be pretty good against most of the field, Dragapult is a good call. ADP is always probably a good call in some respects. So those top decks are the top decks for a reason. But I think a control style deck, could also be a very good call in the right hands. So that is going to do it for my sort of Limitless Q3 analysis, deck thoughts. Hopefully this was helpful. I know there's going to be a bunch of videos like this out there. So I appreciate any of you who watch this for watching it all the way to this point. I hope I could share something new, some new thoughts for you. Definitely leave me any questions out in the comments. I'm certainly not the most expert in everything, but I have thoughts. But thank you all for watching, and I will catch you in another video. Carpe awesome.